Good evening, and as we say in Greek, kalisparasas. Welcome to the National Hellenic Museum. We are so thrilled to see everyone in this space, in this beautiful, incredible space today. So we thank you for being here. We also thank the folks that are watching virtually. Thanks for joining us. I want to begin by saying how grateful we are to be able to gather together again. I would like to thank our wonderful partners at the Mies Society and IIT. It's been a joy working with Cynthia Varanus-Olson and her incredible team to produce this event. Our academic partners mean the world to us, and we hope this is just the first of many collaborations. So we thank you and this distinguished panel. I also want to thank our board president, Mr. John Calamos, for his philanthropy and leadership. Mr. Calamos and our board of trustees and distinguished advisors have generously supported this museum and really navigated it through thick and thin, including the recent pandemic. And as you know, and you'll hear more about later, Mr. Calamos is an alum of IT, so he's deeply committed to both institutions, and we're so grateful for his support. Lastly, I want to thank our museum team that you'll see around here. I'm so fortunate to work each day with people who are committed and truly committed to the mission and love their work and bring their passion and energy every day. Tonight, we're going to hear from a distinguished panel about the blend of classical Greek influences and constructivist form in the work of Mies van der Rohe. How fortunate we are, especially living in Chicago, that Mies immigrated here in the 1930s and became head of architecture at IIT. An examination of his life demonstrates the impact that immigrants have on their adopted lands. As a museum dedicated in large part to telling the Greek-American immigrant story, we are always happy to celebrate the contributions of immigrants. Mies's work and teachings influenced generations of architects in Chicago, across the country and world, and many of you in this room today. And speaking of influence, I do want to point out that we have a group of undergraduate and graduate students joining us tonight. We're so happy to have them here. They're studying architecture, design, preservation, and they come from IIT, UIC, UChicago, DePaul. We even have someone from King's College, and of course the School of the Art Institute. So this is our next generation, and soon you'll be influencing the built environment and how we experience our cities, our towns, our infrastructure, and our public spaces. So you have a great task ahead of you, and we look forward to watching the fruits of your labor. Everyone's presence here tonight demonstrates an eagerness to learn about the best of what history has to offer. At the museum, we know a little something about learning from the past. Our mission is to share Greek history, art, and culture, and to make these stories relevant. We do this by providing engaging programs, exhibitions, and events like this one. We also house a collection of over 10,000 artifacts, which includes oral histories. These are, documented first-person accounts of the experiences of Greek Americans. So we hear firsthand about the immigrant experience from the people who lived it. We also have online enriching programs, podcasts, YouTube channel, lectures, and a thriving book club. So please be sure to check us out and to engage with some of that programming. There's basically something here for everyone at the National Hellenic Museum. So please stay tuned. We will be opening an exciting exhibition this fall, and please save the date for our gala, which will be held September 10th at the Hilton Chicago. As you can see from this room and just from the energy here, we're excited about the future, and we have big plans. So please support our work by following us on social media, joining our mailing list, making a contribution, becoming a member, and just help us and partner with us so that we can continue to build on this incredible legacy together. And with that, I would like to introduce Cynthia Varanus-Olson, the director of Mies van der Rohe Society and adjunct professor at the College of Architecture at IIT. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. It's such a pleasure, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. So my question is, what's so special about the Parthenon? I'm of Greek descent, and I'm always amazed when I go to Greece at the effect this structure has on me. But it's not just me. On a flight from Athens to Chicago, an Argentinian gentleman sitting next to me, and I asked him what he visited in Athens. He replied, his eyes became wet, and he said, "The Parthenon at the Acropolis." That's all. I was astonished. I asked him what he knew about Greek history, to which he replied, "Mom, forgive my Greek, but Elines είναι εκείνοι που μετέχουν στην ελληνική εκμάθηση." Greeks are the ones who partake of Greek education. There's no doubt that knowledge of language makes a remarkable difference. I realize now that the vocabulary of architecture is something that extends a historical and cultural richness beyond language. This vocabulary reflects ideas that were conceived of and or utilized in ancient Greece. I asked him, "Τι θα επισκεφθείτε στο Chicago?" I asked, to which he said, not hesitating, Crown Hall on Illinois Tech's campus, the one I think was inspired by the Parthenon. So what's so special about Crown Hall? You'll hear more about it tonight from the experts. The building was initiated by Mies's ideas about universal space and from basic principles of construction, materials, and expression of structure. The building was raised to a level of art, in my opinion. The IIT Mies van der Rohe Society and its board are committed to preserving Mies van der Rohe's legacy at IIT while maintaining the architectural integrity of his buildings there, 20 buildings by Mies. We're grateful to work closely with Ernie Eisenmenger, our VP of Advancement, and his colleagues, many of whom are here tonight. Peter Kilpatrick, our provost, Reed Kroloff, the Dean of the College of Architecture, our great partner. We are thrilled to have our president, Raj Ichambadi, whose commitment to community engagement is a critical part of IIT's goals. Raj believes that Mies's buildings, ideas, and our campus are an important part of enhancing the educational environment for our students. He also recognizes the importance of a classical education, which in ancient times was to produce good citizens through the arts and sciences. Raj told me the other night he believes in its value today at IIT. Our thanks, our deep thanks to Marianne Contouras and her colleagues here at the Hellenic Museum as our co-hosts, and our partners, the Benjamin Marshall Society, Jane Lepeau, Society of Architectural Historians, Pauline Saliga, our own College of Architecture, Reed Kroloff, and thank you to our advancement team's events director, Meg Munch, and her team for their amazing and tireless efforts. A special thanks to our distinguished presenters, Peter Kilpatrick, Michael Lykoudis, Carol Ross Barney, Kevin Harrington, and Reed Kroloff, whom you'll hear more from in just a few minutes. So being the director of the Mies van der Rohe Society, I should follow the philosophy and say less is more and get to the point. As we greeted each other at Easter 1 year ago, Mr. John Kalamos and I had a conversation about our common backgrounds and interest in the Hellenic, his deep passion for the Hellenic Museum and mine, which serves as a cultural center for anyone interested in Greek culture and education, and the Illinois Institute of Technology, from where we both graduated, along with the goals of the Mies Society. To that, he said, "Mies ya olimas," Mies for everyone. About Mr. Kalamos, finally, the point. The National Hellenic Museum's executive chairman, John Kalamos, grew up on Chicago's West Side, where his grandfather emigrated from Greece. He developed a strong work ethic at a young age, working alongside his parents in the small grocery store they owned, The first in his family to attend college, Mr. Kalamos graduated from IIT, earning a BA in economics and an MBA in finance. Through the school's ROTC program, he enlisted in the US Air Force, served on active duty in Vietnam, and retired as a major. In 1977, he founded Kalamos Investments, a global asset management firm. A pioneer in convertible securities, Mr. Kalamos launched one of the first convertible funds in '85 and one of the first liquid alternative funds in 1990, reflecting a focus on innovative financial products that continues to this day. Through Mr. Kalamos's passion for architecture, he engaged none other but the grandson of Mies van der Rohe, Dirk Lohan. Dirk, where are you? There he is. Dirk Lohan, also an alum of IIT and a Mies Society board member. Dirk was retained to design the corporate headquarters in Naperville. Today, Kalamos Investments oversees billions of dollars in assets. An active philanthropist, Mr. Kalamos is a driving force, as Marianne said, here at the museum. And at Illinois Tech, he established endowed chairs in business. Dean Bilson is a product of this. Dean Bilson from the Business College, please stand. And established the John and May Kalamos Endowed Chair of Philosophy with Professor Trout, right here, philosophy. And finally, Mr. Kalamos is a member of the Board of Trustees. So with that, I'd like to invite him to make a few comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for all those nice words. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the National Hellenic Museum. We take great pride in our partnerships with the educational institutions, and as an alumnus of Illinois Tech, this relationship is particularly significant to me. I know firsthand the importance of valuable work that Illinois Tech does and the dedication they have to their students. My education from Illinois Tech provided me with a foundation to become the person I am today. This evening's topic also resonates deeply with me here in Chicago. I'm proud to be from Chicago and a Greek American. Tonight, we will hear from how classical Greek architecture influenced the work of the German-American architect Mies van Roo, who in turn helped shape Chicago's urban landscape. I went to Illinois Tech to study architecture, and I love Mies's work there and all that. And then when I built my corporate headquarters, I contacted Dirk Lohan, and he built all my buildings out there. So the Mies look is there, and I'm very, very excited about that. And this is really why, this is important here. At the National Hellenic Museum, one of the goals is to always make the connection. We want to make the connection between the past and the present, between Greece and America, and between the Hellenic legacy and the world. We do this because we believe there is value in finding the threads that bind us together. In doing so, we see how we're all connected. One of the great legacies of Hellenism is that it has always been a big tent. Hellenism brings together the very best of what Greek civilization has produced. The Greeks knew from a very early time that by following the threads, by making the connections, we could enrich our lives and our culture. This is a foundational part of the Hellenic legacy. A passing glance at the buildings designed by Mies would not immediately conjure the images of the Parthenon or the Temple of Apollo. But tonight, we're going to hear about what binds them together. We're going to find the connections and let us always remember all these threads that bind us all together. We really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Now I'd like to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, Reed Kroloff. Reed is our panel moderator, our great partner, member of the Mies Society board, and most importantly, Dean of our College of Architecture at IIT. He's a nationally renowned leader in the fields of architecture, urbanism, and design, and he's here to help moderate the program and keep these speakers presenting beautifully and fluidly, and I'd like you to welcome Reed Kroloff. Yeah.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you to Mr. Kalamos, to the Ms. Contouras, to the museum, to the Mies Society, to all the partners. I especially also want to take a moment to welcome the students who are here with us tonight. Can I see a show of hands for students who are here? Yeah, baby, there you go. Welcome, and we understand that they represent all kinds of colleges and universities in the area, which is just terrific to see us all here in the shadows of the University of Illinois at Chicago. It's nice to have everybody here in one place, so welcome. I'm delighted to be the Master of Ceremonies. I like being a master whenever I can. It rarely occurs, so this is one of those nights, and I'm going to enjoy every minute of it. But I'd want to start by just saying, Mr. Kalamos brought it up just a moment ago. Why we're here is Hellenism. And for those of us who were liberal arts majors as an undergraduate, the center of our curriculum, the center of our learning, the center of our research. And if you were asked to compress Hellenism into one tiny 3-word sentence or 4-word sentence, it would be, to me, the search for the ideal. And the ideal is often very difficult to find. In fact, I would say that almost none of us ever achieve it. And that's the beauty of Hellenism, is you can't ever actually get it. You can only be along the way. And being along the way is what makes it so much fun, because we can all experience that process of growth together. And it does link hundreds of societies of the present, societies of the middle past, societies of the ancient world, with that long string in the search for the ideal. And I think we're going to hear that discussed by several of our speakers tonight, and I hope you will all enjoy them. Here's the format. Each of 4 speakers that you see here before you will make a 10-minute presentation, after which we will ask you to ask questions of them. So take out your notepads. There will be a quiz when this is done. We really do want everybody to participate. You'll see there's a mic standing right there. It's for you. And so we hope that there'll be a lively set of questions at the end. If there are not, we will have to send you to the roof. Okay? We will have to send you to the roof. So I'm really hopeful that there'll be some good questions before, to keep us all from being banished. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers very briefly. They're all distinguished in their field, in the field of architecture, in the field of science, and then we will ask each of them to speak. It gives me particular pleasure to introduce our first speaker, my boss. Well, I have 2 bosses. There's another one right there. Actually, I have 3 because Ernie's here too. So this is the life of a dean, is working for everyone else. But we're particularly lucky at IIT to have an incredible group of people in leadership, one of whom is standing on the stage here. We refer to him as Peter the Turncoat Kilpatrick, because we're losing him, sadly, in about 4 weeks. I'm thrilled to tell you that this distinguished and esteemed scientist, chemical engineer, who has a liberal arts training at Occidental before he got his PhD at the University of Minnesota, is leaving us in June to become the next president of the Catholic University of America, which is a great institution located in Washington, D.C. And I can tell you, no matter what his educational background may or may not be, they are so lucky to be getting this person amongst them. A true scholar and a true humanist, which is even maybe more important than a scholar, and someone with whom it's been a great pleasure to spend 3 years. So please help me welcome Peter Kilpatrick.
So I don't know if I'm your moment of entertainment before we get to the real architectural scholars, but I want to make a few key points tonight about classical and modern Mies. And I want to start with what John said, that Hellenism are the threads that bind us together. And I'm going to start with a question. And the question is, what is truth and what is beauty? And I think this is a central question for us tonight because it's at the heart of what a university is, and I think it's at the heart of what architecture is all about. So a little bit of an outline of my talk. I want to answer that question, what is beauty, and why is it so important? Why does this matter to us? I want to spend some time on beauty and architecture, and I, in particular, want to focus on radiant form, and then I'll apply that to Mies. What did Mies have to say about all this? So why is beauty so important? Well, the whole idea of a university was dreamed up by these two characters right here, Socrates and Plato, 2,500 years ago. And they originated the idea of what's called the liberal arts. So why do we call the liberal arts the liberal arts? Well, these are the things that we learn that liberate us, that free us to be truly human. And what does it mean to be fully human? Well, if you're fully human, then you know and you love and you appreciate the transcendentals: truth, being, wisdom, beauty, goodness, and unity. And so how do you do that? Well, Aristotle said beauty is all about symmetry. It's all about order. It's all about mathematical precision. Keats said beauty is truth and truth is beauty. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And Oscar Wilde, I love this quote from Dorian Gray. He says, beauty is a form of genius. And so what are the ideas that are being captured there? Well, let's go to the dictionary definition of beauty. This is, I believe it's the Heritage Dictionary, but the Oxford Dictionary has a very similar definition. A pleasing quality associated with harmony of form or color, excellence of craftsmanship, truthfulness, originality, or other often unspecifiable property. And I would argue that you can distill it into these 6 or 7 things I have here, but especially harmony and mystery. So the whole focus of my talk is going to be, how do we find harmony and mystery in architecture, and in particular in what Mies did? So if we go back to the Greeks were really into math. They discovered this really interesting thing called irrational numbers. So for example, by solving this really interesting little mathematical problem, they discovered the quantity phi. And phi is an irrational number that's at the heart of what's called the golden proportion. So what you see here is a spiral which is embedded in the golden proportion. The long part of the rectangle is phi, and the vertical part is 1. And this is at the basis of the golden rectangle. It's at the basis of the Fibonacci sequence. It's at the basis of pretty much all of architecture. It's at the basis of the Parthenon. And just to prove it to you, people have circumscribed the Fibonacci sequence on the Parthenon. If you look at the pyramids, I got carried away with myself there. If you look at the pyramids, the quantity phi is embedded in the structure of the pyramids. I could show you a picture of the Mona Lisa. Phi is embedded in the artwork of the Mona Lisa. So this concept that harmony or form or order is really important to beauty, I think, is all over architecture, it's all over artwork, it's all over the natural world. But there's another element here. There's something really mysterious about this quantity phi because it's an irrational number. So what did maybe the most famous scientist of all time have to say about beauty and mystery? Well, what he said was, I have really deep faith that the principle of the universe will be beautiful but simple. And then he says, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. So even Einstein, who many could argue we never really truly understood his philosophy of life because he was a little mysterious about it, but he obviously believed in beauty as simplicity, harmony, order, and mystery. And some famous people and not so famous people have written about beauty and mystery, and I just quote a few of them here. The 14th century Japanese playwright, Yugen is the inner beauty manifesting itself outwards. John Mark Miraval, 21st century theologian, in his book, Beauty and Why It Matters, talks about beauty as harmony and surprise. So this theme of harmony, order, and mystery is all over both artwork, architecture, science, nature. So what does that have to do with Mies? Well, I'm going to make one more point, and that's about form. So what is form? I think my favorite definition of form is Jacques Maritain's definition in Art and Beauty. So Jacques Maritain was a mid-20th century philosopher, political scientist, theologian, and he wrote, "Form is the ontological secret that things bear with them, their operating mystery." That's what form is. And it's a vestige or ray of the creative intelligence at the heart of everything that's created. Another way of describing form is the inner radiance of things. It's what tries to communicate to us why something is the way that it is. And I'm going to conclude with just a couple of comments about Mies. So I would argue if you look at Crown Hall, or you look at any Mies building, I could have done this with Kasich Hall, I could have done it with Cunningham Hall, I had nice photos of them that I think would have nicely illustrated this point. He clearly knew about harmony and symmetry, and so you can find the golden rectangle, you can find phi all over Crown Hall. But there's something else going on in Mies's buildings that I would argue is deeply mysterious. And I'll just make a couple of comments about this. Have you ever wondered why the inside of Crown Hall is just one big giant room? Because he invented this idea that you could suspend the whole building with a few cross beams, with these steel girders. That's mysterious. Have you ever wondered why he planted the trees that he did around Crown Hall, the specific trees that he planted around Crown Hall? Well, when you look at them in bloom, and then when you look at them after they've dropped their leaves, you begin to appreciate how beautiful they are and how much they complement the building. Have you ever wondered why he built all of his steps out of travertine? So there are a bunch of things about Mies's aesthetics that I would argue are mysterious, and they make you wonder what was going on in his mind when he created this. And then if you get Dirk Lohan to tell you about this, he'll tell you about some really mysterious things about Crown Hall, how it's not a perfect golden rectangle because of some things Mies had to do to meet budget and some other things. But I'll conclude my brief remarks with just a comment that my take-home message for you is that beauty and mystery are at the heart of higher education. They're at the heart of the liberal arts. They're at the heart of architecture and art. And they're certainly at the heart of Mies's genius when it came to the way that he created his buildings. And in that sense, he's a Hellenist. He's one of those threads that pulls everything together for us. Even though, when I first looked at his buildings, I was like, I'm a classicist. I'm not sure I like this. But I came to appreciate his genius over time, and I've been truly enriched by it. So thank you very much.
Okay, that's what an IIT scientist sounds like. Can you imagine what the art historians must sound like? I'm expecting you to get up and give a disquisition on molecular theory here, Kevin. Why not? Thank you very much for those comments, Peter. Our next speaker is, in fact, an IIT art historian, a distinguished professor emeritus of art history, in fact, Kevin Harrington, who I think probably an awful lot of you have either seen or heard or had the opportunity to tour with. He taught at IIT for many years, but he also has taught over the period of his career at a number of other universities, not limited to the one across the freeway over there, one in Austin, Texas, known as the University of Texas, the Brandenburg Technological University, and a university as far away as Brazil as well. So he's got a very, very distinguished career. He is noted as an expert on the city of Chicago and how its architectural heritage developed, but his knowledge extends far beyond that. Please help me welcome Kevin Harrington.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you to all of the people who made this building for us to be in and the evening for us to be. Now, I'm used to spending 50 minutes of your time in a darkened room where you're entitled to fall asleep so that you can see the images on the screen, not me. So if it's at all possible for all of the lights in the room to go down so that the images will be a little bit crisper, I would appreciate that. Otherwise, I'll cope. One thing about my title, and I'll get to the subtitle in a few minutes, is you could also put the question another way. What if it was classicism versus modernism? Or what if it is classicism is modernism? Now, all possibilities, I think, are open, and that's what I want to speak with you about today. Let's go back to the beginning. This is, as you can see, an unusual image of Athens with snow on the Acropolis. And there are 2 points that I want to make, or 3, or maybe 4, see, I'm a teacher, about the site. Not only is it in snow, you can see the Parthenon itself, but it's also good to remember that for the Greeks themselves, for the Athenians, the most important site on the hill is to the left in the image, that much, much smaller temple, the Erechtheion, because that's where Athena made her special gift to the people of the city. So we always need to remember those kinds of questions. I also point out that the theater that you see below the Acropolis is not the great famous theater of Dionysus, where all of the competitions among the Greek playwrights occurred. No, this is the one that was built by Herodes, a Roman, in imitation of the Greeks. That is to say, the Greeks have been being imitated for a very long time. And for those of you who know about Greek theaters, you'll remember all of the different ways in which this theater is not a very good example of the type. I'll also point out that we tend to see classical architecture particularly frontally, but I want to make the point here. This is a plate from a doctoral thesis written in Berlin by Konstantin Doxiadis. Mies owned a copy. It's in the library over there, and his interlineations can be found in the copy. And the point of Doxiadis' thesis is that, unlike the way most people taught Greek architecture, the Greeks saw their buildings in 3 dimensions, not 2. And so as you look at all those lines, those visual lines on the plan, they're pointing out to the fact that, that when you first see the Parthenon in full, after you've come through the propylaea, you see it in 3 dimensions. You don't stand in front of the object. There are other ways of thinking about how architecture works. You may know that art generally is often called the imitation of nature. Nature is posited to be the most beautiful thing we know. The purpose of the artist is to make something as beautiful as something in nature. And architects and musicians have had trouble for a long time saying, well, we don't know that there's very much Bach naturally existing in the landscape. We don't know that there's very many classical temples existing in the landscape. How do we treat it? So in the 18th century, a Jesuit priest named Rohe wrote a book about it, and his frontispiece is this, in which it's imagined, well, this is how architecture can imitate nature. The trees will come together in a perfectly ordered way. Their branches will form a gable, and we'll have a house. There you go. Architecture can imitate nature. And next to it, you see an image of Mies standing in front of the Farnsworth House under construction, in which you can also see the idea that the space is, the Farnsworth House could be understood as a natural object, a primitive hut, something that can be found in nature. Now, I need to say one more thing, and that is, going forward, there will be text on almost all of the screens. In some cases, the text will simply identify the building or the object or whatever. But in most cases, there will also be text that like somebody said that, and in every case this evening, it will be words that Mies said. So to begin, and I'm sorry, I flipped my page, but I didn't flip the page for you. Oh. And no, come on. There we go. So it's Mies who said that he didn't want to be interesting, he wanted to be good. And so here you can see Mies, this is the chapel where Mies went on once a day when he was in secondary school in Aachen. It's also known as Charlemagne's Chapel in Aachen. His school was in the square to the north of it. And so when he was in secondary school, this is where he went for chapel. This is quite a famous building, quite a spectacular building, and I've always thought that if he didn't have it already from knowing stones from his father's gravestone business, he would have been taken by the beauty of the stones in Aachen. And you can see, too, that he has a number of ways of ideas of thinking about what to say about architecture. And then here's Mies himself, right? The hero, the Greek god of modern architecture, if that's possible. Standing with Crown Hall, this great monument of his, we're supposed to say, okay, story over, game over, everything that we need to know is here. And you can see as well that he had very high ambitions for the building. I want to make one little aside as well. And this is to get, and I think that looking at the building, as Peter just suggested a few minutes ago, the regularity, the order of the building is something that derives from a classical idea of order and symmetry. Okay, that's all fine. But you couldn't go into a Greek temple. That was reserved for only a small elite. One of the big changes that happens in Mies's work and that happens in modernism is that a temple-like building, a temple to education, not to some imaginary goddess, a temple to education is accessible to the people who study there. It's open to everyone. This is I think we would say, not a symposium set out in the gardens outside Athens, but set in place directly. Now, on the left, you see the Altes Museum by Carl Friedrich Schinkel in Berlin. On the right, you see Crown Hall, and I'm not the first person to make this comparison. Mies admired Schinkel extravagantly, and there is no doubt that among other things, the frontality of the Altes Museum and of Crown Hall, seen in this regard, are similar. There's also no doubt that the partie, that's an architect's term for the overall layout of the plan of the building of the Altes Museum, is essentially the partie of Crown Hall, a significant central space surrounded by subsidiary spaces. back one, please. Thank you. I tell you what, I can't make this sucker work, so I'll simply raise my hand, and then we'll get that. And all of that messiness with the images is my fault, believe me. So here are two more buildings on the IIT campus, and I show two different buildings in plan and in elevation to reinforce the point that this idea that you saw at Crown Hall was already well established at Pearlstein Hall on the top here, in which you can see the entrance. The entrance is made clear because it is transparent glass, right? And it is symmetrical. It is open to everybody. There's a door on either side, which means that as you approach the building to go into it, you don't see it frontally, you see it from the side. Notice too that there isn't a door on the central axis. The doors are to the side, which again is a way for Mies to have it and not have it. So both things are in play. The symmetry and stability, the axiality, the frontality of this, but without that central axis that provides a sense that there is only one way. That's being rejected here. There are multiple ways to get into the temple. And I'm sure that by now you've already picked up on the fact that the curving seats in the auditorium here in Siegel Hall, but this is true also in the other classroom buildings on the IIT campus, are derived from the idea of the Greek theater. Not a bad, and again, that sense of it's still a good idea, isn't it? Which was a story told about Mies in multiple ways, is worth thinking about. Oh, yeah. Here's the Parthenon facade. I want to talk now about the corner. Mies corners are pretty famous, and for those of you who like Mies and know Mies have all had some experience with it. Well, the corner in Greek architecture is a big deal too, or in some Greek architecture. And I'll point out that, and ask you, those of you who know about this argument have probably picked up on it already, you know it. I'll suggest that you take a look at the space between, let me see, yeah, the space, I'm sorry, the space between the outer two columns on either side of the facade. And as you look at that space above it, in between the triglyphs, where the metopes are, you know those pieces of marble that were stolen or are in the British Museum? Those are smaller. That is to say, the intercolumniation at the outside of the facade of the Parthenon is pulled in because it's argued, and here we are now making it up. Historians are pretty good at this. The Greeks didn't write very much at all about their architecture. We know very little about it. But the corners are pulled in with the assumption that by pulling in the corners, you make the building itself be more stable and more secure. It's something that if you pick up on it, it's a powerful thing, but initially, you're not even expected to notice. It's only after a while. It's one of those subtleties, one of those refinements, one of those things that you might even say fall into the category of mystery that Professor Kilpatrick talked about. Mies didn't need to worry about holding up the corner of a building with a big stone column. So in this steel building on the IIT campus, what does he do? He flips the story. He cantilevers those two end bays of Crown Hall. The corner is very important, but he ain't following the rules set down by the Greeks. So again, as I hope is beginning to be clear, in some ways when it suited him, Mies could be a classicist, a quite obvious classicist. In other ways, when it suited him, he dealt with what he took to be the central issues of his own time. Thank you. And here to just kind of reinforce that and drive it home, here's the corner of his first classroom building on the IIT campus, the then called Navy building, now we call it Alumni Hall at IIT, and at the right corner edge you see a sketch detail of the corner of the building, and it's usually interpreted that here the point of this is that the enclosure, which is subsidiary to the structure, pulls back at the corner of the building and you see the actual steel structure of the building. But of course, this is a modern building, there's issues about fire, so that's a piece of, that's a channel of steel that goes over the fireproofed actual steel column, so that the building would be both secure but made visible to us. So, which is another way of saying that just like the Greeks used various visual techniques to make something seem believable and workable, Mies also had recourse to that. Now, it's often said if you're trying to solve a problem for a corner, you solve it either for the outside corner or the inside corner. And here's the inside corner in Crown Hall, and that doesn't read as, no, it's a different building, but it doesn't read as the inside version of that outside corner. You were just looking at something else is going on here. He's worked very hard to make the inside corner in Crown Hall be something that would be expected, logical, and entirely persuasive. Another way of thinking about Mies as a classicist. Here again is the Parthenon with its plan, and then to the right of the plan of the Parthenon, I've highlighted the cella, that is to say the sanctuary and treasury of the cella of the Parthenon itself. This is, in fundamental ways, a standard Greek temple type. And below it you see Carr Chapel, the St. Savior Chapel at IIT, which we've all been in, and you can see its plan, which is, to my eye, a ringer for the cella of a Greek temple. It so happens that to go to the chapel, for most people, you have to walk from the western end of the chapel around it before you go into it, which is what you have to do if you were lucky enough to be able to go into the Parthenon. The entrance isn't that first piece of the Parthenon you see, it's all around to the other side. That's where the giant cult statue of Athena stood. And that too was the case here. In fact, it's always seemed to me that Mies's landscape designer colleague, Alfred Caldwell, understood that, and the plantings of locust and crabapple and hawthorn around the building are in a way similar to the sacred grove out of which it's believed that Greek temples were first developed. So all of that is to say that while we think of Mies as being a modestly educated person, he only went to secondary school, Dirk or the library at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and many people can tell you this was a serious, serious person who paid attention to what was important to him and what was around him. And so he would, when it made sense, again, harken back to something else. Also, I should say, this is Mies's only bearing wall building on the campus, and it's the only building on the campus that is entered on axis through a door in the center. So this, again, the circumstance changes, and so what happens on the interior changes. But let's talk more about both beauty and what modernism is, what it is to be modern. Mies liked to borrow from St. Augustine, another fairly smart guy who wrote about lots of important things, including beauty, that beauty is the mirror of truth. And here you see Crown Hall mirroring the landscape around it. At the same time, you can see into Crown Hall. That is to say, Mies got, he wasn't the first, Schinkel seems to have figured this out himself, but Mies got that the big sheets of plate glass that were available in the later 19th and throughout the 20th century, with their properties of simultaneous transparency and reflectivity, was a new kind of aesthetic capability, a new element of beauty. And in recognizing it, he then said, how do I take advantage of this? And here I think you see a good example of its occurrence at Crown Hall. Could we have the next thing? I'm sorry. Inside Crown Hall, you see, and so we're now talking about the quality of light, that Mies is taking light and allowing light itself to be what it is you're paying attention to. It's often said that a Greek column, for instance, like the ones I see right across the street, they reveal themselves as light falls over the surface, and the shadow patterns of light falling across the surface of a fluted column is a very powerful kind of idea. Well, Mies doesn't want to build a fluted column. He's perfectly happy to deal with the piece itself. And here you've got him in a late afternoon in the summer, so the sun is setting to the north, illuminating the interior of Crown Hall in this powerful way. Or then on another occasion, if you stand inside, another way to stand inside and look out is you, as again, Peter Kilpatrick said, the surrounding landscape becomes very important, and you can read Mies's quote about how he didn't realize how colorful nature was. I think this is a rhetorical game he's playing with us. It's hard for me to have looked at his work in Europe before he got to the States and not think he didn't understand color. I mean, think about the stones in Barcelona. Nonetheless, here it is. He's playing with that at Crown Hall. And if you think for a second that view out the windows, whether shaded in the lower zone or transparent in the upper zone, was not something that Mies thought about thoroughly, and that Alfred Caldwell, who did the plantings, didn't understand thoroughly. You've got another thing coming. This is something in which this is deeply intentional and part of what's going on. So that, to the left here, you see Siegel Hall, the south elevation. In the winter, actually this looks like the spring because the understory is starting to come out, with the trees against the facade. And then just recently, those trees got chopped down for a reason I will never understand. And the building is, it seems to me, damaged. We don't see the facade on the right hand of the image as something that enhances the building. We see it as being damaged in a serious way. In fact, if we look at it in the fall, when the Jim Dine Venus, bronze casting of the Venus, was on a trailer bed that was moved around the campus, at the idea of the student who won the competition to do, the question was, where would we put a statue by Jim Dine? The student who won said, well, you know, most of the students at IIT don't go to art museums very much. They don't know a whole lot about art. Why don't we move the statue around the campus on a trailer bed, and then it'll be in front of everybody. It'll become part of their own life rather than something far away and distant. Well, at the end of its tour around the campus, it ended up in front of Siegel Hall, which, is most of you, I'm sure, know, is just beyond the north door of Crown Hall, so that the architecture students had a good view of it. And now I want to go fairly quickly through three images, again reinforcing this point about the integration of landscape and architecture, that they're the same thing. And I both hark back to the idea that anyone who has visited a classical site, whether in southern Italy or in Sicily or in Greece itself or on the southern coast of present-day Turkey, anyone who has had those experiences know that the natural world in which the classical buildings were set play a very powerful discussion with themselves. And here on the Mies campus, you're moving through what's known on campus as the Mies Walk. And initially, this first image seems to be just landscape. And then as you get closer, you see, oh, well, it's an integration of building and landscape. And at the end of the pathway, you discover that you're now brought to a view of the facade of Alumni Hall, but that's not the door. In fact, to the left of that, the solid bit tells you that's where the stair is, because that's Mies's convention for telling people what the parts of the building are. And to the left of that, you can barely make out what's beyond it. So that brings me then to this idea that what Crown Hall is itself, and what Mies's idea of architecture is this quality of the building as this vessel of light. The text says reliquary, which I think is apt, but if that's too strong for you, then a vessel of light. How could you more beautifully illustrate space? That lower row of windows substitutes for the stylobate of a temple. It still participates in the idea, but it substitutes for it. Those white travertine steps float It's always fun to watch a visitor come and see the white steps and then say, how is it held up? And because you make it of steel and you hide it and you hide the steps and you hide that, it's visually gone, the steps seem to float. That is to say, more mystery, more magic. And then to conclude, the one thing I've talked about Mies and landscape throughout, that he and Caldwell worked very, very closely and richly together. But I always find it intriguing that Mies's grave in Graceland Cemetery, his gravestone, designed by his grandson, is set in a picturesque landscape, not in a classical landscape. I still like it quite a bit, but we don't always control every aspect of our life or our experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And now that we've heard from, or we've seen the Mies and the modernist perspective, we're going to welcome our next guest, Michael Lykoudis, who has been a professor at Notre Dame University for over 30 years, of which nearly half of that was spent as the dean of the College of Architecture, during which time he helped bring the school to national prominence as a place that took the history of architecture, particularly the classical tradition, very, very seriously and put it forward as a meaningful alternative to what had become really the generally accepted expectation of architecture schools elsewhere, all being about modernism. And so he helped create an important dialogue, a dialogue that we are seeing continue to this evening, and I'm delighted to have our friend Michael Lykoudis. Michael.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me, and special thanks to the organizers, the Mies van der Rohe Society, the Illinois Institute of Technology, the College of Architecture, and of course, the National Hellenic Museum, where we are today. I'm going to ask you this evening to look at dissimilar or contrasting things, ideas, pieces of architecture, and see continuities in them. And in doing so, that you might also see modernism's contribution to classicism and to tradition. In doing so, I will, please indulge me as I take you on a kind of personal journey to start, but I hope that it'll be worth it in the end, that you'll see my points about modernity, tradition, and the continuity of life. It is working, okay. Well, I'm going to begin autobiographically. I was born in Boston. This is not Boston. This is Lafayette, Indiana. But I quickly moved with my mother to Lafayette, where my father was studying. He was a PhD student at Purdue University, studying aeronautical engineering. And I spent my Sundays in his laboratory after he became a faculty member, amongst disassembled airplanes and dismembered rockets and things like that. He was also involved in the space program, mostly with heat shields, and I grew up thinking, with this as my backdrop, I kept up thinking of the future as infinitely expansive. And that's a key point there. The part, I think you've seen this building a little earlier in the presentations. My mother was an archaeologist, and she was studying in Boston, and I made sure that in the course of my life that I saw all the archaeological sites in Greece and other places. In following her, the past was my playground. In fact, I grew up a few hundred meters, my summers at least, a few hundred meters from this building, and play football, European football, soccer, we call it soccer, in the cella of this building, because there was nobody there when we were, during the times that we would go up with my grandfather. So in a sense, I grew up thinking of the past as a foundation for the future. And every summer, with few exceptions, my mother and I would take the train from Lafayette to Indianapolis,
and then on to New York City. And in New York City, I had the great pleasure, which I didn't appreciate as a child, of being in Penn Station, the old Penn Station. And we would get off, we would spend a few days in the city, seeing friends and relatives, and then across the city to the west side and board the Olympia or the Queen Frederica. Some of you may know those vessels, those ships, and we would cross the Atlantic. The Olympia is the third ship from the right. It's partially hidden if you're curious about ships and transatlantic travel and all that. Anyway, we would cross the Atlantic. It would take about 5 days to get to Gibraltar, which was the first sight of land. And another 5 days here to Piraeus, a sleepy little port on the eastern Mediterranean, which was not so sleepy when the ship would arrive. Bedlam would ensue, unloading of cargo, and eventually we would make it to my grandfather's car and end up in what was then the outskirts of Athens, but is now the center of Athens. And it was a beautiful drive. I remember the tranquility, the dust, the quietness of the streets, the desolate streets, because it was usually midday. And what I didn't appreciate is that this summer times that I would spend in Athens were actually the beginning of my architectural education. I saw that public buildings had a certain monumentality. They had a certain hearkening back to the past, et cetera, et cetera. They occupied the major spaces of the city. And our neighborhood, this is not it, but it's similar, was a mixed-use place where everybody could go anywhere. In fact, I would routinely at 5 or 6 walk across the street and to another block and pick up things from my grandparents, something which I'm sure my parents today would have been arrested for. But it was a safe place. It was a place that was ecological. You lived above where you worked. If you worked further away, you walked typically or took a tram. So it was an amazing place to grow up in, and I began to see, in contrast with Lafayette, certain things that were quite interesting. In fact, the contrast didn't stop there. On the occasions that my parents didn't go to Greece, or I didn't go to Greece with them, we would actually traverse Route 66 to California, where the aerospace companies were, and my dad worked in the summers. And I got to see Americana of the 50s and 60s, but I also got to see Native America, natural America, and many, many other things. So it's a tricky little machine here, so bear with me. So the next few slides, you'll see two towns, or a town and a city, Lafayette and Athens. And it sort of illustrates the shared building traditions of the world, how different cultures, different places have similar traits. It makes us human. So that was the courthouse and the academy, and this is two gates, one to the financial world and one to Hadrian's city. Both towns and cities had made up of streets, squares, and blocks, the DNA of urbanism. And they both had beautiful buildings nearby, either hotels or institutional buildings. And these two buildings always, when I would see them, gave me a sense of continuity between the two places. Both had an Art Deco cinema, the Lafayette and the Rex. And rustic architecture was always nearby. Either it was Fort Wiatnon in Lafayette or a stone village near Athens. And of course, on the way, the Seagram building is not in Lafayette, but it was part of the forms that helped shape my life and made me realize that when the Athens Tower went up, not a particularly attractive building, but nevertheless, something that allowed me to make the connections of how cultures speak to each other, not always successfully. I should point out that I was a terrible student in high school. My mother was so worried about me that she punished me, and she took me to Italy for 4 weeks and to France for 2. So, yeah, really. Well, it worked. because when I got back to high school, I started working and I got good grades, and I was actually admitted into Indiana University on probation, these are the gates. So, but I was not very mature even then, so I bailed out. I did what everybody else was doing at the time, and went backpacking through Europe. And I ended up, guess where? Greece, and in Athens in particular. And there I met an architect who invited me into her office. Her name was Mirto Kostika, and she had studied IIT with Mies van der Rohe. So I didn't really think much of this, because if you look at the slide on the left, the work looks pretty traditional. And her work typically was a little bit more modern, like this, borrowing traditional forms from Greece, but a very, very restrained tradition, and mostly open, free plan buildings and such. But the other side of her office did a lot of traditional buildings, like this one, which I worked on. Learned how to dry lay a wall, stucco it, put a roof on. I learned a lot in her office. I hadn't even gone to architecture school yet. But if you see her work, you would say, how did this person study under Mies van der Rohe? I mean, look at this stuff. So anyway, oh, there we go. It's a little bit more modern. So, now you're beginning to see maybe, okay, she was a student of Mies. So I left her office, and I finally had the courage to ask her, what would Mies think about your work? I mean, it's so different. It's all load-bearing, and it's traditional, and he was glass and steel, right? And she says, well, actually, Mies was all about integrity. And, it was all about authenticity in the construction, that the construction would say something about the making and the form of the building. And after all, she said, his early work was all load-bearing masonry. It was pretty traditional, but she didn't know that. So, after I went to a trip in Berlin and Potsdam with my friend and mentor, Alan Greenberg, and we saw these buildings. We did a Mies tour, and it was really just amazing to see these beautiful buildings. But anyway, before that, after I left Mirto Kostika's office, I went to architecture school at Cornell, which was important because the dominant philosophy there was that the past informed the future, and that they were committed to the modernist project, but they weren't committed necessarily just to invent things all the time, that ideas had to come from somewhere. And these famous drawings from Colin Rowe's books suggest how Le Corbusier saw Andrea Palladio in his work, and derived his Villa Garsh from, say, the Villa Malcontenta, and other relationships of Classicism's contribution to modernism, which I think everyone is pretty comfortable with at this point, and doesn't question that. But we're going to talk about is modernism's contribution to classicism in a little bit. So other projects that I ran across as I was developing as a professional were the Shepard residence by McKimby and White, and the house at Old Westbury by Richard Meyer. And if you look at these two plans, and they're kind of similar. Unequal legs, axial organization. The front is on the short side. But if you look at the semicircular staircase in the foyer of the Shepard residence, and you look at Richard Meyer's building, you'll see the same circular forms emerge. Richard was looking at McKimby and White. Okay, so we've already beat that horse, so we won't beat it anymore. When I went to Berlin and saw the Altes Museum, which I think Kevin so elegantly talked about earlier, we walked around it and we saw the usual things that we want to see about Mies van der Rohe in Carl Schenkel's work, notably the reentrant corner, which you also talked about a little bit, the panelizing of the walls, the holding of the corner with a pier, and the same thing when we came to take our students here to IIT, and we looked at the reentrant corner, if you will. That's my interpretation of the same thing. And another view of that. And Crown Hall, of course. So now for the other half, and I'll promise to be quick. The Villa Tugendhat is one of Mies's few very solid-looking buildings in his modern period. And it bears a very interesting syntax in common with the work of a Greek architect, Dimitris Pikionis, here. And while Pikionis' work is traditional at first glance, if you look back at Villa Tugendhat and back at Pikionis' Potamianos house, you'll see that the forms are kind of sliding in and out of each other. And in fact, Pikionis' building is a very modern building. In fact, he was a signer to the Athens Charter, one of the Greek signers of the Athens Charter. But he firmly believed in tradition at the same time. So I guess he was not quite, he didn't buy into it hook, line, and sinker quite, but enough that he's been thought of as one of Greece's great modern architects. And his most famous project is probably the paving and the area and the landscaping around the Acropolis, which is made up of stones and concrete in various abstract geometric forms. It's actually quite a modern composition when you see it in plan, which you can't hear. But at the middle of all of this is a tea house and church, the church was reconstructed sort of in a Byzantine but character, and the tea house was built anew. And this is the entrance, and there you can see some Japanese influences because he was very interested in Asia and traveled there, and came back and thinking about how dissimilar cultures can actually talk about similar things. And above all, the defining idea is that we are all human. And as you walk through the tea house, you begin to see some strange things. At first, it looked like a very traditional development, but now look, there's this little entrance with a pier on one side, a bearing wall on another, and a gable with the illusion of a gable through the truss. It's kind of free plan. It's kind of like the Barcelona pavilion of Mies van der Rohe, where the column sits adjacent to the wall, and the composition in the Barcelona pavilion is very asymmetrical, but so is this. So he takes classicism and he starts monkeying around with it through a modernist lens. And then another view of the tea house towards the Parthenon, this transparency. And then the Farnsworth house, as you can see on the upper right, there's a striking resemblance. Now, I don't think that they're actually related. It's sort of like the dorsal fin of a shark and a dolphin. They look alike, but they're not quite the same thing. They don't derive from the same origin, but the ideas behind both projects are very, very similar and very, very compatible. So we move fast forward 30 years or so, maybe 40, and we look at the work of Dimitri Porphyrios, another Greek architect, who works primarily out of London and Athens. And this office building in Reading, Foley Square, is really a reinterpretation of the chapel at IIT. It's got load-bearing walls all the way around, except for the curtain wall middle in the front, except that Dimitri has taken the curtain wall and given it a kind of load-bearing quality by inserting columns in front of it, in front of the curtain wall, which suggests with a capital that there is a condition at the eave, which is different than the condition at the base, because there's a base at the bottom of that column. So it takes Mies van der Rohe's ideas and starts moving them towards classicism, or interpreting what Mies, as a modernist, was thinking to modern classicism. And he repeats this, of course, in this building, the Inter-American Insurance Headquarters in Athens as well, with the Acropolis in the backdrop. And a striking resemblance in my world to the Inland Steel Building, one of my favorite buildings in terms of being a kind of icon of the architecture of optimism, the chrome, the blue. It's a stunning display of the wonder of modernism. And Dmitri takes that and sort of dulls it down a little bit so it has the patina of the Acropolis and the grit of Athens around it. And of course, we all know these two buildings, and I don't need to belabor the point of Hammond, Beebe, and Babka's engagement of Mies's work on the Plymouth Court side of the Harold Washington Library. But we go back to Dimitri Porphyrius and Alvar Aalto, another well-known modern architect, and we can see the poetic influence of Aalto on Porphyrius. And Porphyrius actually worked for Aalto, and Aalto was his mentor. So this is not a far-fetched suggestion. And we further abroad. We go back to Philadelphia. We go to Shanghai, and we can see, that the role of tradition in the massing and the form of the buildings now skinned in glass and steel. So there's another layer to this contribution of modernism to tradition. And my last pairing here are Le Corbusier's townhouse or row house in Paris, compared with a building that was recently built, I think it was 1994, that's why the question mark is there, of Javier Seneca Celaya, architect in the northern part of Spain. And you can see the relationship of these two, the single column at the middle, the I-beam, the steel I-beam in Seneca Celaya's building suggests modernity. The curtain wall of the bay that's pulled forward, which is like the one of Corbusier. But yet, one building assumes a vernacular and a classicism, but yet also has taken contributions from modernity and employs them without irony, without any sort of judgment. So, to conclude, I think we all looked at the modern and the future through the foundation of our past. And that's kind of how I began this talk, speaking of my own understanding about how life unfolds in front of you. But perhaps it's also time that we look at what modernism was, its own modernity, and look back at tradition and then back forward again. So it becomes no longer simply a series of sequences, but a dialogue. And that's how I hope we all end up in the world in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Oh, don't steal this. We're going to conclude our presentations with someone who anyone in Chicago barely needs an introduction to. Carol Ross Barney is simply one of the most famous architects living in the United States today, and she's ours. And you can experience her work because, unlike a lot of architects who spend a lot of their early years, at least, and many later in life, building beautiful private homes or private buildings for people, Carol's entire career has been in the public sector. And it hasn't culminated yet, but I will say that there are many culminating events in it, one of which is something we can all enjoy, and many of us do all the time, especially right now at this time of year, which is the Riverwalk in downtown. And the Riverwalk is so important to me in Carol's career, despite her many, many beautiful award-winning, design award-winning buildings. She has more awards than most people have relatives. It's just dozens and dozens and dozens of them. But the Riverwalk talks about what Carol does best by dropping you 10, 15 feet below the street level. She makes you rethink how cities look and feel entirely, because your perspective is utterly different when you're down there. And it makes you appreciate everything even more than you did before, which is exactly what her buildings do as well. So please help me welcome Carol Ross Barney.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for asking me to be here. I was a little confused when Reed asked me to be on this panel, because in full disclosure, I didn't go to IIT. I'm a U of I graduate, UIUC. I have been on the faculty for nearly 30 years, but so some of it's in my soul, it's rubbed off, but that was a new idea, the idea of Mies modernism. And then when I did go to school, history was important, but we were in our post-Beaux-Arts period, and it was a new world. It was about what could happen next. And we didn't spend a lot of time looking for beauty in the traditional ways. And so for me, this is a really interesting topic, because I think that architecture does need to be beautiful. And I have to confess, I'm an agnostic on this. I don't know if there is an answer that you can apply, but I think there's a lot of things you can discuss that I think we're just just scratched here on the surface of the remarks tonight, which have been amazing. Modern buildings are extraordinarily complicated, and I wish that I could say there was a way to, I'm going to talk about only one building. I wish there was a way I could say yes, that there's something I can measure it against. There's a standard, and I know what proportion, and I know what rules to follow. But generally, that's not what's driving modern architecture. It's just too complicated. And I'm going to talk about a small building. The building's only 8,000 square feet. You might have gone by it. It's a new McDonald's flagship. It's Clark in Ontario. Working for McDonald's is a trip, because in a way, they represent American design, American culture. They've changed America. And so, thinking about them and making a contribution is it's a hard goal. This is some of the architecture that they've done. But the site that they had is really interesting. I think before we worked on it, it was called the Rock and Roll McDonald's. And they regarded it as their flagship. And when they hired us, by the way, they wanted a Chicago architect, so they interviewed some very good Chicago architects. And they wanted to have, they gave us no design brief. They just wanted to have a special building, which sounds easy, but it was very not easy. The site is complicated because it's a full block in River North. It's one of the most popular sites in the city. This drawing just shows traffic to it. It's complicated because nearly everybody has to drive by it coming into the city from the interstate, and it's only a few blocks off Michigan Avenue. To top it all off, this area is changing. It's changing from warehouses and parking lots to something that's pretty dense residential. And they said, we don't have any brief for you. And so we started out talking about complicated. We didn't know where to start out. It certainly wasn't looking at proportion. We looked at their corporate goals, and their goals are almost all about sustainability. And we admired that tremendously. So the first question we asked them was, well, what about being a good neighbor in this changing area? This drawing shows how many parks there are close to that site. And you can see there's almost none, even though the people are living here. There are no green spaces. So we suggested to them that we take their parking lot, which is shown in the little upper sketch, and turn it into a park. That's the first idea we had. It wasn't about, it was about beauty, but in a totally different way than trying to define it. And okay, I have this under control. Not. Okay, so this is our finished site. In the end, we reduced the paving by about 50%. We still have to park there. That's the reality of living in an American city. But we were able to introduce a park. Interesting sort of side thought, we did investigate whether we should give this park to the city. The city didn't want it. It's much easier for McDonald's to maintain it. It's sort of like our modern politics. So this is the site plan, and if you knew it before, you can see we have a lot more green space now. We still have to maintain a parking lot. So that was the number one idea. Beyond that, we talked about how we could share this site. So we worked on making an emphasis on pedestrian traffic because that's what this part of the city is becoming. And we introduced the idea of shared streets, which is the plaza you're looking at right in front. But these are the kind of ideas that were forming this building. There were needs. They were technical needs, they were neighborhood needs, they were cultural needs. Don't let me drive. Oh my God. Now I know what you guys were going through up here. I thought you were just going slow because you couldn't. No, I'm kidding. See, don't say anything before. Interesting, the other thing is McDonald's has a very ambitious plan for 2030, but mostly they've been talking about the effect that their product and their basically supply chain has on the planet. Because, I mean, quite honestly, eating hamburgers and eating beef in terms of sustainability is quite evil. And it's good to know that by 2030, McDonald's expects to replace a large portion of their menu with plant-based foods. And they also are working at improving the cultivation of those that aren't plant-based. So, you know, basically changing the way we raise beef. But they had never applied that to their building. So we said to them, well, why, now that you're going to be a good neighbor and have a park, why don't you also see what you can do with your building? And we challenged ourselves, we want to make this a LEED Platinum building. The LEED Platinum is like measuring the skid, and no restaurant had ever gotten close to it. So we started out, just as a reference, half that building is recycled. So that was another form giver. It wasn't that I could make a new proportion or a new form. I had to use what was there. I had to use that footprint. We had some ideas about indoor air quality and just the quality of space, so we did introduce some indoor planting. That was a big idea. And overall, our sustainability initiatives they're shown on this slide. I'm not going to show you each one. A lot of them are heavily vested in energy and not using energy. The rest of them are invested in building reuse. This shows the little blue box there, shows how much of the building was reused. Basically, we reused the kitchen. It was the most expensive part. We didn't want to change all the utility hookups on the site. That's what's giving this building form. I wish I could say it was a corners, but it's not. But maybe it is. I'm not totally out of it yet. The solar array that tops the building actually provides about 65% of the energy that the building uses, which is kind of, I was surprised by that number here in Chicago, especially since restaurants are huge energy users because their basic activity is to burn stuff, you know, so that's going to use a whole lot of energy. We originally introduced the idea of this solar array to create shade for the site. We built, if we had a park, we'd have shade. And in the end, by topping it with the solar panels, by PV panels, you can see the energies that we've saved in the graph below. So that was a form giver to us. It wasn't, like I said, we weren't looking for rules. Planting, it was extremely important to us. Even indoor planting, you can see that we have a tapestry of plants. On the roof, if you drive by it, on the roof we have a producing farm. We have apple trees growing on the roof, and you can see our first harvest down in the carrots there. Those are grown on our roof. One of the oddities of Chicago law, and I think maybe more cities in Chicago, is we can't cook the food that we produce on the roof in the restaurant. So it goes to Ronald McDonald House, which is quite interesting. However, here's the building. So I'm motoring along, I'm making a beautiful building, but I'm seeing it coming out of the need, out of this part of the city, out of what this building needs to do in its role in our society. And Reed asked me to participate in a talk about proportion, and It's like, wow, yes, I love the proportions. But does it follow the rules? And this is kind of amazing. This is going all the way back to Peter's talk. Are there magical rules that we follow secretly? That's crazy, isn't it? I can guarantee you that this is not, I'm not fudging the diagram and I'm not fudging the photo. That's for real. And then you go deeper into the building and the components are set that way too. That's like pretty amazing. But, you know, I think that, so I'm standing here in front of you today and I have no answers. I only have questions too. So if you ask me questions, I'll probably say, I don't know. But in any case, I think there is a value that's deep in our soul that we have been trying to discover, and part of it is proportion. I'm not sure about the rule giving. I think that's a human trait too, to find out the rules and the formula so you can do it over and over again. And when you look at this is a really working class building. I mean, what do you do here? You eat hamburgers. Come on, that's not very noble. It's hard. It's got all kinds of cooking lines and stuff like that. But to make it work in the city, it has to have a nobility that does go back to our idea about proportion and about rhythm. And I stole this from Cynthia. I hope you don't mind. And I've come to think that maybe one of the things, and why we need to have meetings like this one, and why we need to understand and talk about about design. Design is like the most powerful tool we have. Why we need to talk about design and talk about precedents and rules is because Peter talked about the fact that in the end it's mystery. It's what delights you. And to do that, you have to have rules so you know where you're deviating. So here, you can see this traditional column, Doric. I did learn that out of Illinois, even though we didn't have a great history program. No, we had a great history program. Carol was just stupid about it. But if you look at the columns, and by the way, I had a wonderful structural engineer, Bob Magruder. These columns, they say, they can barely hold up the building, but they have those same elements. They follow the rules, and we know it, and we understand it, and it delights us, and it makes us wonder, and it brings us to the point where we can ask new questions about who we are and where we're going and what we should be to each other and to the city that we live in. So I'm still an agnostic, but I hope that my agnosticism at least helps us create a new and better conversation about what is beauty, what's responsibility, and how we can all live together in our communities and in our city. So thank you.
Now, I know we've all heard the expression temple to capitalism, but that one's about as close as it gets. I personally think, and I'm speaking to you now, not just as the Dean of College of Architecture, but as the former editor of Architecture magazine, that Carroll's McDonald's is one of the most important buildings in the United States built in the last 25 years. It is a building that effortlessly resolves so many competing agendas, seemingly effortlessly, resolves so many competing agendas, whether they are the agendas of construction in the modern age and how to live in a time when even the use of the most basic material has implications for everyone on Earth. How to actually occupy a building. When was the last time you were in a McDonald's with a suspended garden in the middle of it? When was the last time you went to a McDonald's that grows food for children in the hospital? And finally, for today, if you can't see the resolution of classicism and modernism in that building, you can't see. They just come together perfectly, even though it's a very modern building. it's broken into two pieces. They don't quite match. It's not a perfect temple. All those columns aren't exactly in the same proportions. But my God, they're gorgeous. They're gorgeous. And they do look like a temple, even though the roof is a solar collection panel pod. So I think that that building is an extraordinary and perfect conclusion for tonight's conversation. Now, we were originally going to have lots and lots of questions, but somehow these people ran over by an hour. So I'm looking out at our hosts, and I'm wondering if you still want to try and do questions, or should we take my stirring conclusion as a moment? I'm seeing a yes there. As to say thank you for these people. What an absolute treat. I would like to just thank once again all of the folks you've heard from tonight, thanked tonight, but in particular, I'd like to thank the museum for being our host tonight. The Mies van der Rohe Society for thinking up this wonderful event. Our wonderful panelists. And last, but most certainly, John Calamos for making all of this possible. And now if you would join us on the roof, because you were so badly behaved, if you will join us on the roof, the elevators are just out around the corner. We'll have a reception there, and we'll see you all upstairs. Thank you so much.